Hi, welcome to this new episode of Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. The missing link, Ape Men, Neanderthals, Lucy. These and other terms refer to fossil remains from the Earth's past. Now, the Bible tells us that the human race originated with two people who were created by God supernaturally, Adam and Eve. Do the kinds of fossils and skeletal remains I just named, and others, disprove this account of human origins that we find recorded in the Bible? To explore this extremely important question and the actual evidence from the fossil record, we have a special guest joining us today, Dr. Todd Wood. Todd is a PhD in biochemistry, and he's the president of the Core Academy of Science. Dr. Wood, welcome to Digging for Truth. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's good to see you, and it's good to have you on the program. Now, I just did that intro talking about, terms that people out there have all heard, going to school, in popular media, Neanderthals, and these kinds of things. We're going to get into that today. But you and I thought it'd be best to start with the term Ape Men. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that term. What exactly does it mean when we hear somebody say Ape Men?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've been sort of trying to dig up where these ideas came from, Ape Men and the missing link. And it goes back, as far as I can tell, not to Darwin himself. When Darwin published Origin of Species, he was sort of famously hesitant to talk about human origins. He just sort of left it as a tiny little note there hinting at the idea that maybe humans evolved as well. But the real place where I find this most explicitly emphasized is in a book by T.H. Huxley. He was called Darwin's bulldog, right? He was a very vigorous supporter of Darwin, and he wrote a book called Man's Place in Nature. And in that book, he talks about, he has a passage where he's talking about the similarity of humans and apes and how he was emphasizing how similar they were. And then he left this little detail here that he wanted to make sure that everyone understood. He said, "Let me take this opportunity then of distinctly asserting that they are great and significant, that is, the differences between humans and apes.
Yes.
That every bone of a gorilla bears marks by which it might be distinguished from the corresponding bone of a man, and that in the present creation, at any rate, no intermediate link bridges over the gap between man and ape." So he used that actual word there, link, that set up in the popular imagination this idea of the missing link, the thing that would connect human beings to animal apes, right? And so over the next 160 years, every time someone finds a fossil, they want to connect that fossil to this concept of the missing link that Huxley was emphasizing in that book. And so every time it's remarkable how often that idea gets repeated, that finally the missing link has been discovered and here it is.
Yes.
And now scientists have sort of changed the way they think about these things. And so in the modern conception of evolution, there isn't really a missing link, and no one's really expecting that an actual link would bridge between living human beings and living apes. They emphasize the idea of a common ancestor, and they wonder kind of what that common ancestor might have been like.
Right.
But you don't really hear about the notion of a missing link too much anymore.
So that's fascinating. So there's two things I hear you saying. One is it came from somebody who is effectively an atheist preacher, because that's what Huxley was. He certainly proselytized literally about atheism, and he saw Darwinism as a justification for his atheism. So it didn't come from a scientist. And what I also hear you saying is that scientists don't really use these terms today when they're talking about human evolution, as it were. Is that right?
Yeah, not really. Yeah, that's right. They don't really use those terms. You hear them more in the press. Sometimes they'll talk about the missing link.
Yeah.
But
fascinating.
Anthropologists today are pretty emphatic when it comes to that missing link idea. They want to emphasize that it's not missing because they found all sorts of fossils that fill in the gap, and they want to emphasize that the idea of a link is just sort of a pre-Darwinian idea and not really something that an evolutionary biologist today would be worried about.
Well, that's fascinating. So let's turn our attention to another very familiar term. We're going to get started with this, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more in the next segment. Very important, Neanderthal. Now that connotates a brute, a barbarian. But I'm going to let you explain about 2 minutes what a Neanderthal is, and then we'll talk a little bit more in the next segment, some of the details about Neanderthals. Why don't you go ahead, please? About 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, 2 minutes, quick.
Yep.
Well, I have one here. So this is a model of a skull that was found, a Neanderthal skull that was found in 1908. This is La Chapelle-aux-Saints. It's found in central France. You can see some of the differences here. The nose is pulled out. The nose is extremely prominent on this specimen. You can see the brow is extremely heavy. The forehead is quite low. And yet the entire skull here is quite large. In fact, the average brain size, the cranial capacity of Neanderthal is larger than modern Homo sapiens, modern people. Also, one little small tidbit here, they don't have a chin. Our mandibles all have this pronounced projection right there, which is the chin, but that's absent in Neanderthals.
Very interesting. So now I remember I've watched a number of your presentations. They're fantastic. One of the key features of the Neanderthal, though, is where the spine goes into the bottom of the skull. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. I forget what it's called, the big hole. I know there's a scientific term for it, but if you could go ahead with that, that would be great.
That's the Foramen Magnum, which is literally Latin for big hole. It's the opening where the brain stem comes out.
Yes.
And goes down the spinal column. So this is the primary opening for the nerves. It's on the bottom of the skull, which is where you would typically find the foramen magnum for something that walks around on two legs. So what's really remarkable about that is that you can end up with just a skull, right, and still have some evidence of how the creature walked. In chimpanzees, which are quadrupeds, the foramen magnum tends to be pushed back towards the back of the skull, because they, of course, are walking around like so, with the spine coming out this way, down the back, right? And so they want to keep their faces forward, and they do that by having that foramen magnum in the back. Whereas if you're walking around on two legs, you've got the foramen magnum right underneath, so you can have the head on top, face looking forward.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, we're going to talk some more about Neanderthal features and the importance of their connection to modern human beings, and we'll do that in our next segment. Please don't go away. We'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm joined today by Dr. Todd Wood, and we're discussing fossils from the past that resemble or look like humans, terms like ape men, missing link, Neanderthals, and so on. Very important conversation we're having about the evidence from the past. Now, Todd, we were discussing Neanderthals, and you were showing a really cool looking Neanderthal skull. But let's talk some more about these amazing discoveries, because they've been found in Indonesia, Germany, Rome, Croatia. Tell us more about the Neanderthal and its relationship to modern humans.
Yeah, the Neanderthals are very widespread. So they're found in Europe, they're found in Western Asia. They're found in Central Asia. They're found in even in the Holy Land. We have remains of Neanderthals. There are more than 400 Neanderthal individuals known from the fossil record. So this is not just like an old guy with rickets that someone mistook for something else. There's a lot of fossil remains that are very consistent. We have young Neanderthals, very young children from the fossil record as well. So this is a pretty well attested group. And what's most remarkable about them, we were sort of talking about this earlier with this idea of how the new fossil discoveries get portrayed in sort of apish ways. Well, as the old man from La Chapelle, that skull that I showed you, when it was discovered, the earliest drawings of it showed it basically looking like a gorilla. They portrayed it with hair everywhere and this gorilla face. It looked like it was an ape. Because, of course, they're emphasizing this intermediate status between human and ape, right? So they have this ape walking around upright like he's a human being, but he's covered with black hair and got a big ugly ape face and looks mean and stuff. But the modern conception of Neanderthals is very, very different. The modern understanding of Neanderthals, we know, for example, that Neanderthals are associated with very sophisticated stone tools. They were able to really utilize the stones around them to make some really amazing things. There's a few places where they're associated with bone tools, not very many. And I think one of the more remarkable things is the pigment use. So there are places we know where Neanderthal remains are found where you have what appear to be shells that have been painted and have little holes drilled in them by the Neanderthals.
Fascinating.
And it appears that they were wearing them around on little strings or bits of hide or something, like they were decoration, right? Like they were wearing jewelry.
Jewelry, yes.
So Neanderthals go from being these sort of gorilla things, which that idea was born out of ignorance in the early 20th century, to now here in the early 21st century to being incredibly sophisticated individuals who were able to utilize their environment in remarkable ways, used fire, used tools, probably buried their dead. So they become more and more human the more we explore and study them. It's pretty fun.
It is very interesting. So the $1,000,000 question for people who've never heard this before is, are Neanderthals human? And you can answer that question about some of the scientific part by telling us whether you are a Neanderthal, Dr. Wood.
Yes, I am part Neanderthal.
You are part Neanderthal. Well, tell us all about it.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things that came out of the Neanderthal Genome Project, as people got better and better and better at sequencing ancient DNA, we found this really curious thing that Neanderthals tended to be more similar to people of European or Asian descent than they were to people from sub-Saharan Africa, which at first the researchers thought this must be some sort of random thing or error, but later it turned out, no, in fact, we carry around genes from Neanderthals. And I've had my own genome tested, and to take it with a grain of salt, because I'm not sure that the full analysis was done, of course, but there is reason to believe there in that DNA test that I have genes that I've inherited from my Neanderthal ancestors.
Fascinating.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. So what we see from the evidence is really, it looks like human behavior, human traits, the big hole, and the DNA studies really kind of clinch it. So what we see here is human beings from the past who are outside a little bit of the scope of what we would normally think of humans in the modern day, but no reason not to think that they are actually, in fact, were people made in the image of God.
Right. Yeah. You're right on both those counts there. The form of the Neanderthal, their development, their DNA, those are all slightly outside of the range of what we have in the modern world. But nevertheless, the whole suite of evidence that we have of their tool use, their fire use, their hunting, the sorts of the way they treated their dead bodies and so forth, it's all extremely human. And I have no reservations about saying Neanderthals are human. And I would say most creationist researchers who've looked into this sort of thing have come to the same conclusion. Neanderthals are human beings like we are.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think that will clear up a lot of confusion for people who have never investigated that. So now we're going to introduce a new fossil that is a little bit more controversial, radically different in many ways, but important. So we got a minute to introduce Homo naledi, and then we'll pick up on him in the next segment. So go ahead with your introduction on that, about a minute.
Sure. Yeah, Homo naledi was found in 2013 in a cave called Rising Star, which is about 30 miles northwest of downtown Johannesburg, South Africa, one of the most densely populated cities in the country. The explorers found bones down there. Apparently no one had noticed these before, and pulled out of that cave then over the next couple of months were almost 1,500 bones from a single type of creature. So this is a three-dimensional print of a model. So it's a model from one of the scans from one of those fossils. And you can see that's where the eye socket would have been right there. Okay. And so then this is the brain back here. So this is what these fossils would look like roughly when you find them in the ground. And there were 1,500 of these things, so it's a pretty big discovery. And you can already see here, I can put my hand almost over the entire curve of this skull. So these guys aren't very large. And so the entire composite looks a little bit like this.
Okay.
There are additional fossils from other spots in the same cave, but this is Homo naledi. And you can see it looks a little bit like a Neanderthal. It's got a big brow ridge here, but there's a lot of other things that are quite different than Neanderthal.
Well, we're going to pick up with those features in our next segment, and we'll be right back.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host Henry Smith, and we're talking about Neanderthals, the terms ape men, missing links, and fossils from the past and their relationship to the Bible. To help me with that is Dr. Todd Wood today, who's here to talk about these very fascinating remains that have been found by scientists. Now, Todd, in our last segment, we were talking about a little guy, I guess we would say, Homo naledi. So pick up from what you were talking about there, and let's talk more about this cave where they were found and the features and so on.
Sure. So Homo naledi here, you can see it's a really small skull. The tooth wear can tell us something about how old they were when they died. And so we can see that a lot of the remains of Homo naledi that were found in that cave were rather older individuals, and some of them were juveniles, infants. Small brain size, pretty big brow ridge. The brain is maybe a third or 40% of the size of a modern human brain. You can see, looking at the profile, that the mouth tends to stick out a bit. There's a slope here, unlike ours, which is more vertical, up and down. This face has a nice slope to it. And yet, the location where these were found is deep underground, way far back. The chamber where they were discovered was essentially inaccessible except for one tiny little 11-inch opening that you had to crawl down to get into that chamber. And once in the chamber, then it was full of these skeletal remains, some of them all still articulated. So it was as if you saw a hand where the flesh had just rotted away and the skeletal elements were still all in order. This is really unusual in the African fossil record. Tend to find their bones that are pretty disarticulated, so that the bones have come apart from where they were in living creatures. But in the case of Naledi, you often find things that are all nicely connected together. It's amazing. But what's most amazing about it is that there's nothing else in that chamber. Most of it was the vast majority was Homo naledi. There were a few rodent teeth and a couple of owl bones that looked like an owl had gotten lost down there. But otherwise, that was it. Other cave remains from the area tend to mix all sorts of different species together. They tend to be the result of animals and people falling into sinkholes that they didn't notice.
Right.
So this one, there's no connection to the surface that way, and it appears the best explanation that has been put forward to explain how they got down there is that they were intentionally put there. That Homo naledi was taking members of its tribe or whatever and dragging them down into the darkness to bury them in that chamber, which, again, strikes me as an extremely human behavior.
Yeah, it does. It does. And that's the thing, I mean, as a non-expert in this, when I've read about that and saw these presentations about that, it just looks like a human activity. Now, I'm sure there's some that look at these skeletons because they are quite different than the Neanderthals. I mean, it's got the big hole though, and it's got some of the features, but they're a group of very small statured people. So one of the things that you've said in your presentations is that if these are human, then it kind of makes us expand our notion of what a human looks like. Maybe talk about that for a few moments, if you would.
Sure, yeah. So the Naledi, the average height is a little more than 4 feet. The upper skeleton above the waist seems to have the sorts of anatomical features that you would need for climbing. But below the waist, they tend to look a lot like modern Homo sapiens, human beings.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that does sort of raise the question: have we identified these correctly? And so, traditionally, creationists have used the skeletal similarities of fossils to say that what is and isn't human, looking below the neck. But here, below the neck, it tends to be divergent from what we see in modern people. So the question is, are they really human, or, how do we interpret this? How do we interpret the burial evidence and the anatomical evidence? Does this really call for us to expand our understanding of what humanity really is? And I tend to think, I can't think of any other way those skeletons got into that chamber. So I tend to think, yeah, this is probably telling us, confirming other analyses that these are really human.
Yeah. It seemed that way from a layman's perspective, and it does sort of challenge. Now, we do know that there are human beings that do have a small stature, maybe the Aborigines or people who are just born that way with a low. So I guess it does seem possible that within range of the human genome that a group of people of this stature is plausible. Does that seem like a logical conclusion that I'm drawing?
Sure. The height is possible, but the way the shape of the shoulders, the shape of the arms, and the rather peculiar shape of the thumb in particular is something that's really different from anything really. It's not like anything that we've seen before.
So, well, this is good. We got about a minute left. I think one of the things I'll say, I want you to comment on this, is that we're trying to be open to inquiry about these things. We know what the Bible presents about history of man, and then we have this evidence, and we have to sort of work our way through it without overreacting to what it is or what it is not. Maybe you could finish the show. I'll give you 45 seconds to finish up this part about that kind of thought process.
Sure, yeah. As I'm looking at these fossils, I'm seeing a lot of opportunities for exploration and study and understanding. And yes, I absolutely believe the Bible. I know that it is true. I know that it tells me about the history of the world. I have no doubt about that. But trying to fit this evidence into that framework, well, that's another question. And I think that we can be open-minded about that, especially with so much that's still unknown. And that's what excites me as a scientist. There's so much that we still have to learn.
Yeah, we get the same lessons from archaeology. Well, we're encouraging folks to not miss the next episode where we're going to build on what Todd and I have talked about here with these skulls. We have more to share with you, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the biblical connections. And until next time, friends, thank you for joining us for this episode of Digging for Truth. We hope you join us for part 2 with Dr. Todd Wood as we talk about fossil remains from the ancient past. Thank you for joining us today.